that as our only shout out for today. I appreciate that, Liz.
It's okay. I just
Oh,
realized
well,
that. I'm like,
welcome.
I've looked at this, but here we are.
Same. I typed it. So here we go. Do you want to head to the next slide and I'll go over our goals today? For those of you just joining us, we are so glad you're here. And I am just excited about our guests for today. We're going to look at identifying the current generations in the workplace right now, and we're going to look at how to grow in our understanding of appreciation for colleagues, since we're all working with people in these different generations. And then the goal is that we could be more equipped to work effectively together as we discern what differentiates and unites us. So feel free as we go through this presentation today to add questions in the chat throughout the presentation. I will help monitor that. Liz is happy to stop the presentation at any point and answer questions. And we have some dedicated time at the end too. So let me introduce you to Liz Robertson. She is the co-founder of 1014 and is passionate about translating the experiences of different generations so they can maneuver effectively through challenging workplace dynamics. She has spent the last 20 years leading and developing emerging generations through her work in higher education. Liz's interest in emerging generations inspired her to conduct an in-depth doctoral research on Gen Z in the workplace to better understand how generations can productively work together. She holds a PhD in global leadership and change from Pepperdine University, and she can be found reading a book with a matcha latte in hand and traveling with her husband, Brad, to visit friends and family across the country. So I'm thrilled to have you here with us today, Liz, and we are excited to learn from your expertise. I'd love to hear what prompted you to invest in this work and why you believe it matters.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. I'm really delighted to be with all of you today. And my hope is that this is going to be meaningful for you, that you feel welcome to ask questions, type questions in the chat. I have some designed audience participation, which we'll mostly do through the chat, because I want to hear from you and I want all of you to be seen and represented in the presentation as well. So when Nicole asked, wow, why did I spend all this time researching Gen Z? Well, let me ask you, have any of you seen any news headline, any Instagram reel or TikTok, anything potentially disparaging about Gen Z in your life? Well, I sure have. And I was realizing, wow, I'm seeing so much negativity about this generation of students. And I was at the time working on a college campus. I was actually a resident director living in an apartment in a residence hall. I lived with the people, I was with the Gen Zers all the time. Well, I'm going to go ahead and move us over. If you're ready to join with me. Now, I'm not going to be able to see your hands. If I can see your hands, or you can just do this where you're sitting by yourself, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being really low, 10 being really high, how confident are you in your own understanding of generations in the workplace? And there's no judgment here if you're like, okay, I know there's more than one generation. Some of them have names. Okay, great. See some different numbers. Sometimes people are like, or feel free to type it in the chat if you're willing to share with the group. Maybe 5, 6, 7. Okay, we've got great variety. My hope is that by the end of our time, whatever number you started with, it goes up by at least one number. It doesn't need to go like, I went from a 2 to a 10, but maybe we can get from like a 2 to a 3 or a 4. How many of you watched the show Ted Lasso at any point? I'm hoping some of you did. If you did, feel free to throw in the chat like, yes, I love Ted Lasso. It changed my life. There's so much about the show Ted Lasso that was a master class in leadership. And there's this great scene in the first season where our hero, I would say, Ted, is in, he's in this bar, he's playing darts with this miserable man named Rupert who owns the football club. The stakes are really high, and whoever wins the game gets to have ownership of the club. So this is like a really big thing. And Rupert is just so full of himself. He doesn't care about Ted. He doesn't want to know about Ted's life. And they're playing on and on. And all of a sudden comes this critical moment where Ted starts telling the story about being a little kid and how he used to play darts all the time. Because the reality is, Ted is awesome at darts, and Rupert has no idea. And Ted closes the scene after he wins the dart game by acknowledging, hey, I would rather be curious than judgmental. And that has always stuck with me. There are some people who say that Walt Whitman said that quote. That's actually not substantiated by any research, which is why I said dubious origin, because we're not sure, and I like to give proper attribution. So my hope is as we talk about generations, all of which are different for their own reasons, we can come from a place of curiosity rather than judgment. And I remind myself of that all the time when I'm interacting with people. I'm like, Liz, be curious, be curious. And I'm like, but I want to be judgmental. Be curious. So sit in it. Let's get curious together and learn a little bit more about the generations in the workforce. There's a brilliant author named George Orwell who wrote a rather tragic tale called 1984 that you may be familiar with. It may be triggering right now with the realities of all the things going on in the world. But he has this brilliant quote that said, every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. So I will openly acknowledge I am a millennial. I for sure think I'm a lot smarter than my parents who are baby boomers. But then when I look at those young Gen Zers, I have so much more wisdom and life experience. So we all tend to think that we're better than all the other generations. That's just our human condition. So let's hold that intention as well as we look at all these generations. A few disclaimers because we can't cover everything, in a 1 hour session together over probably for many of you, what is your lunch break? I recognize that generations are one part of our identity. It's not the whole of who we are. We are also identified by different genders, by race and ethnicity, by the role that we might play in our family, where we are in birth order, our country of origin. There's so many things. So recognizing generations are one part of that. There's also a whole group of people who were born kind of right on the border of generations. We call those people cuspers. They're special. We might even consider them the elite crew because they really can understand what's on both sides of them and be great mediators in the workplace. Another important note is that really until the last few generations, and I'd say specifically starting with millennials, so born around 1980 to 1995, generational names and identities were determined by country, by nation, and there was not a global sense of this is what every generation is. So if you think about in the United States, the baby boom happened for Western countries who participated in World War II, and then there was a boom of babies after World War II. That did not happen globally. And in fact, many countries were suffering after World War II. So being mindful that different countries have different years that they would determine and different names for generations, and they've become more globalized, starting with millennials and now especially with Generation Z. Let's take a look at who are the 5 generations in the workplace. So the oldest generation are what I call traditionalists. There's some other names. Some call them the greatest generation or the silent generation, born from 1925 to 1945. You may be thinking, is anyone in this generation still working full time? And the answer is yes. There are not many of them, but the last institution I was working at, we had a full-time employee who was 83 years old, still working full time. So whether or not you are working directly with traditionalists, I guarantee that you have some alum who are traditionalists and their perspectives are influencing the work that you're doing. There are a lot of traditionalists who are sitting on boards of organizations, who might be trustees, so recognizing they still have a significant role in shaping who we are. Then we've got our baby boomers who were born from 1946 to 1964, followed by Gen X, born from 1965 to about 1979. Then come millennials, whoop whoop, that's where I identify, born from 1980 to 1995. And then we've got Gen Z, born from around 1996 to 2010. We're not focusing today's presentation on Gen Alpha, which is a generation that comes after Gen Z, but if you have questions at the end, we can chat a little bit about them too. All right, let's begin with our traditionalists. They've also been known as the silent generation and the greatest generation. I believe it was Tom Brokaw who named them the greatest generation, which is cool. It was a way to honor, their lives and their history. Yet, can any generation really say that they are the greatest ones? Like that feels a little bit like cheating to me. Let's take a look at what shaped this generation. So our traditionalists came of age. They were influenced by World War I, the New Deal, Korean War. Many of them had parents who lived through the Great Depression, and that really influenced the way they look at life and look at work. They had a lot of hardship and then had some times also of prosperity. So in thinking about the events that shaped and defined this generation, were really rooted in some painful things, world wars, Great Depression. If you look at some of the exemplars I put here, you may be familiar with people like Johnny Carson, Shirley Temple, Elvis Presley, and Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin's going to come back up in our presentation later, so just get ready. It's going to be great when we talk about her. What did media look like for people who are part of this generation? Well, the big thing was they had radios in their house, and that was the cutting edge technology. That was the coolest thing. They also were the first to have televisions actually in their home. Because of all those cultural influences that had to do with their technological advances and then what they experienced with world wars, there's a lot of sense of doing what is right, being really patriotic, honoring chain of command, being super loyal to organizations and institutions. And if you think just right now about that type of perspective and how different that is than younger generations, that right there is a huge generational divide. When it comes to how do traditionalists tend to enjoy communicating, they love some personal connection, handwritten notes. I had a grandma who passed away just a year ago at the age of 102. She still loved being pen pals and writing handwritten letters. That was a big deal to her. So just thinking this is the world that our traditionalists have inhabited. After the traditionalist generation came this fancy newfangled generation called the baby boomers. And there's a really cool anthropologist named Margaret Mead who was looking at what was happening between the traditionalists and the baby boomers and all of a sudden said, whoa, kids today, meaning baby boomers, have grown up in a world that their elders never knew. She wrote this in 1970. I feel like this could have been written like yesterday about Gen Z, that kids are growing up in a world right now that we, as those who are older, didn't know because the world has changed so much in that amount of time. So let's take a deep dive into our baby boomers. They were born from about 1946 to 1964. That's a really big range of years. Most of our generations now tend to be closer to 14, 15 years. So this is a really big spread. They were also known as a Cold War generation, really influenced by that. They lived through the growth economy. And then if you've, are familiar with Summer of 69, things like this, also the Woodstock generation. So what made this generation who they are? Well, they were on the leading edge of civil rights and the sexual revolution. The Vietnam War played a really significant role for them, whether they were actually participating, whether they were drafted, or whether they were protesting. It was a significant cultural influence for this generation. There was also a really high expectation of being able to achieve the American dream. If you work hard, if you get educated, the whole world will open before you. You can be president, you can be anything that you want to be. That is really shifted with our younger generations now, the whole idea of even what is the American dream. This was also the first generation where divorce became more common. That used to be very atypical. That started to grow among our baby boomers. So there's a lot of things that were happening, both like with religious movements through the country, like the Jesus movement, the Cultural Revolution, all those types of things. Who are some of our famous baby boomers that you've probably heard of? Well, Steven Spielberg, an incredible, incredible film director. Robin Williams, Larry Bird, Bill Clinton, Oprah Winfrey. And yes, Brad Pitt, as young as he likes to stay, he actually is a baby boomer. What kind of media shaped this generation? Well, when I think about the baby boomers I know, like my parents, all of a sudden they had this cool thing called a color TV. That was a really huge shift. They also had portable radios. You weren't stuck just being in one place. You could actually move the radio around with you. And in comparison to the generation before them that was really focused on let's like help our country, let us let's look to like the larger world, there was this interesting combination of focus back on self. So this is when a lot of the self-help movement began, was with baby boomers. They started looking at things like gender equality. There was a lot of focus on self, and then with that self-focus also came a lot of political engagement, which is interesting. If you look at statistics about the ages of people who are currently represented in Congress, it really over-indexes with baby boomers. When it comes to communication, I know the baby boomers in my life, love a phone call and a face-to-face conversation, a little bit more formal in interaction. If you know baby boomers, they are often known for speaking on these beautiful things without headphones in a way of being on speaker and sharing that with the world. That's a very common thing for baby boomers, and just recognizing that's a shift because the phone has changed so much from when they were younger. It's not comfortable to just like hold a phone like this anymore. So I'd be curious to hear from all of you. Type it in the chat if you're willing. When you were in your teens, when you were in your 20s, what was the cool lingo? What were the words that were like, everybody's saying this and this is what's cool? And I did a presentation a couple weeks ago, and there was a very proud baby boomer who said, my generation came up with the word cool. We invented cool. That was our word. So what are some things that you know, like, what did people say? Oh yeah, rad, gnarly, the bomb. That's a classic. YOLO. So just realizing there's all, oh my gosh, yes, the classic. I'm gonna say something and then be like, not. These are the things that shape and give a generation identity. It's this shared sense of ownership. Oh, these are great ones. Thank you for sharing those. After our really cool baby boomers came a generation known as Generation X. And if there's anyone in this on this call who identifies as Generation X, let me just tell you, there is so much generational pride with Gen X. They lived such a cool childhood life, and there's so much pride. They're always like, we're the best generation. Okay. Also known as baby bust, which is not a very friendly name. And then we're known as latchkey kids because a lot of Gen Xers were raised by parents who were both dual income. And so they were the ones who let themselves in after school and had the key to get in. So let's talk about what makes Gen X so unique. What is this profound shift between them and the baby boomers before them? Well, they looked at the world around them and they saw a lot of things like lying politicians, corporate scandals. They watched parents who had worked really, really hard in the workplace all of a sudden get laid off and realized, oh my goodness, my organization is not nearly as loyal to me as I am to it. And so that has really influenced the way that Gen X engages with life and with work. There were also some amazing technological advances. If you are a Gen Xer on this call, you remember the beauty of things like Atari, having a free range childhood, also VCRs, cable, amazing things. Some of the famous Gen Xers that you may be familiar with, people like Viola Davis, Anderson Cooper, Larry Page. I bring up Larry Page because a lot of Gen Xers have created many of the digital platforms that we use now. So a lot of things like Google, Yahoo, these were created by Gen Xers who had spent a lot of their formative years playing around with technology. What did media look like? So you probably encountered probably some MTV at some point if you were a Gen Xer. A lot of console games. You might have had an Atari, tape decks. Who remembers the days of making those recorded tapes and you'd listen to the radio and you'd wait till your song came on and then you were like, whoop, let me just like hit record and I'm going to make this beautiful mixtape. There's also a really large sense of shared pop culture because Gen X were all listening to the same things. So there's a sense of identity that comes from that. When Gen Xers were looking at the larger world, the workplace, politicians, and seeing, ooh, there's a lot of incongruity here, that resulted in them being a little bit more like, we're going to be cynical. We're going to question authority. We're not just going to accept what we're told. We're going to rely on ourselves and naturally distrust institutions. Think about what a shift that was from the traditionalist generation, who were all about you do what you're told and you do it with a smile because that's how we roll. And they're saying, yeah, I'm not interested in doing that. We're just going to do our own thing. I depend on me. When it came to communication, some of you may have had these cool phones. I remember when we transitioned from the rotary phone to the one with the little cord like that. It was pretty cool. Gen Xers adapted really quickly to things like instant message, email. They're very at ease with digital communication, more so than the generations before them. I would love to hear from you. Feel free to show up in the chat. What was the cool technology for you when you were in your teens and 20s? What was the cutting edge? Like, oh, I really want to have one of those. I think that's the coolest. And then with that, how did you listen to or consume music when you were in your teens and 20s? So take a look. Oh, we've got some iPod. Oh, Sega Genesis. Yes. Napster. Okay. So such a variety. There's people who transitioned from like the Walkman to the Discman to the MP3 player and now the phone. I mean, how many times did you have to buy music collection again, right? We have been through some things, lots and lots of switches. After our amazing Gen Xers came a wonderful generation known as millennials. I would identify as an elder millennial. I was born in 1982. Initially, my generation was called Gen Y because it came after X. And also because there was this whole idea that millennials were always asking, why? Why? Why do we do that? Why are we doing that? And millennials actually gave themselves their own name. They were in a group of them were being interviewed by Peter Jennings, and he was like, "Hey, what do you think you should be called?" And they're like, "We should be called millennials." So I graduated from high school in the year 2000, the start of the new millennium. So that's part of what shaped that name. What influenced this generation? The economy has been all over, up and down and all around. No consistency, like boom, bust, boom. It's just been this for millennials who have lived through it. This is also the first generation where the whole concept of parenting as an activity and an identity became a thing. So parents were saying, we're going to protect our kids. We don't want them to experience disappointment. We want them to be anything they could be. Um, I still remember when Whitney Houston sang the song, I Believe the Children Are the Future. And I was like, we're never going to be able to accomplish all the things that they've set out for us to do. But we were told we could achieve anything. And then as we continued through, when I was a junior in high school is when the Columbine school shooting happened. And realizing, whoa, the world became a really scary place really quickly. Places that were viewed as safe became scary. And then I was in college when the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened. And then since that time, the United States has almost always been at war somewhere overseas. And just realizing the millennials and then the Gen Zers who come after them are also being raised in a really different time of instability in the world, which has shaped who we are and how we see the world. So some famous millennials you may have heard of, Lin-Manuel Miranda, if you have engaged with Hamilton or watched Moana or any of those things. People like Meghan Markle, Constant Wu, Mark Zuckerberg. Think what you may about him. He is a millennial. Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, all some famous millennials. When it came to media, like I was mentioning a little bit before with our Gen Xers, this generation lived through like MTV and then CNN. Now, when I say CNN, you may be thinking, is Liz trying to make some sort of political statement about what news outlets we should be using? The answer is no. What's significant about CNN was that was the start of the 24-hour news cycle. And if you've never thought about that, think about the impact of there always being news, there always needing to be a catchy headline, the information overload, the bombardment, that really started with the millennial generation and has continued to impact where we go today. When it comes to what do millennials look like, what are some traits? Really valuing collaboration, things being fair, very realistic. The word transparency became very popular for millennials. We want transparent communication. We want clarity, clarity, clarity. Very optimistic. Also really interested in things like multitasking. We're going to do all the things at the same time. Millennials enjoy a little bit more casual interaction that can result in some tension in the workplace when they're encountering maybe baby boomers who prefer something that's more direct, more formal, using a formal title. This generation millennials like got really good at doing text the T9 on your phone before you had the full like keypad. Can handle quick video chats, all that kind of stuff. So communication really shifted for millennials. If you're on this call and you were born between around 1978 and 1983, you are an Xennial. You're part of this micro generation that was really influenced by specifically the change in technology. The last generation to have an analog childhood and then completely transition to a digital adulthood. Nobody else has had to do that quite the same way. I would like to hear from you, audience participation. So let's blow up the chat real quick. When you were a teenager, what did you and your friends do for fun? Where did you hang out? What did you do? I would like to know, what did life look like for you as a teenager? It's Friday night, it's Saturday. What are you doing? Where are you going? Mm, the mall, watching movies. Oh my gosh, go to the beach. Where did you grow up, Maggie? I want to know. I like going to the beach. Basements. Yeah. It sounds like a lot of maybe not just, I love it. I love the California. I lived in California for the last 10 years, so I love that beach time. Driving around, just cruising the strip was such a thing. There's a major shift now with Gen Zers, some of whom don't get their driver's license until they're like 20 years old. That is such a huge cultural shift. So let's talk about Gen Z. Originally, this generation was named iGen, like little I, like there's an iPhone, because a generational researcher named Jean Twenge was convinced that was just going to be the name of this generation, and it did not stick. So sorry, Jean. Gen Z is a name that has stuck for this generation. And if you're curious more about where did the letter Z come from, I can give you this whole explanation, all the things. But that's for another time. What has influenced Gen Z? What has made them who they are today? So Gen Zers are currently ages around 15, 16 to 29. So this is all the 20 somethings that are in the workforce. These are Gen Z. For some of them, older ones experienced 9/11. For the rest, they have just known through their growing up years what the war on terror was and what does that mean. They've lived through some major global financial crises and meltdowns, and also living in a really more globalized world. When we look at demographic information on Gen Z, they are becoming more and more diverse. That has to do with race and ethnicity. There are certain states, like the state of California, is already a majority minority state, which means that the majority of people do not identify as white. And so, realizing in a lot of urban centers in the United States, that shift is happening. And that's part of what influences the things that Gen Z values because they're seeing it represented in themselves. This is a generation that has a lot more openness to gender fluidity, very engaged with things like activism and protests, things like Black Lives Matter, which of course was a response to things that have happened here in Minneapolis. Climate change, gun control. It's a very passionate generation who wants their voice to be heard. They have been so deeply shaped by the COVID pandemic. If you're on this call, you lived through COVID. We all did. But I can tell you that my experience being in my late 30s, early 40s during COVID was really different from somebody who was in high school, who missed out on going to their graduation, missed out on prom, didn't get to finish sports, didn't get to be with their friends. There's some really key developmental things that they missed out on. They also have had access to the internet for their whole lives. They're known as digital natives. Smartphones became ubiquitous across the United States starting around 2012. Like everyone had some sort of smartphone, or it was very common. And a lot of, I think, critique on Gen Z right now says, well, it's just COVID. COVID just really messed them up. The reality is, prior to COVID, there was already a lot of research showing that Gen Z was maturing more slowly than previous generations. That even prior to COVID, they were about 4 to 5 years behind the maturity of the generations before them. So if you think about someone who is a college freshman right now, maybe at age 18, would have the maturity closer to like a 14 or 15-year-old, um, uh, sorry, I'm losing my words, millennial before them. So just realizing even that shift is a really significant thing. Some popular Gen Zers right now, you may be familiar with actors like Timothy Chalamet, Zendaya, some amazing Olympians like Katie Ledecky, um, artists like Billie Eilish, Sabrina Carpenter. Those are some of the names and influences that are really popular with this generation. When we look at Gen Z's engagement with media, with culture, it is so different from the ones before. I used to think I was a multitasker as a millennial. Then I started living around and hanging out with college students, and I realized they would be sitting on a couch using TikTok on their phone with their laptop open, also typing a paper while streaming a show on Netflix all at the same time. And that is so normal. It's so integrated into every aspect of their lives. Now, we could have another conversation about what's the quality of work that's being produced when they do all of that together. But that's just a reality of the phone, it's here. There are some Gen Zers who have used the word phygital, like digital, but starting with a PH, meaning they live in a combined digital and physical world. It's like an extension of who they are. So our Gen Zers, digital natives, they have always had access to the internet. They are able to use technology with such fluidity and ease. I remember the first time I saw a 2-year-old working an iPad, and I was like, how do they know how to do that so quickly? It's just their brains are wired to do it. They are really concerned about the future of the world. They look at what's going on with climate, with other types of activism, and they care about what's happening outside of the United States. They're very focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion because, again, they are just a more diverse generation. They care a lot about authenticity, things like safe spaces. There's a lot more openness among Gen Z to talk about things like mental health. And they're also incredibly entrepreneurial. When they get interviewed to say, like, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? So many of them are like, I want to work for myself. Like, that is the dream. I want to be my own boss. When it comes to communication, they do it all. They will say, hey, I'm talking to so and so. Talking means through generally a direct message through an app, not actually talking like you and I talking. So, realizing that's the mode of communication, using things like FaceTime, they're really good at just a short form, quick sort of connection. Like, I'm going to FaceTime to talk to you for 45 seconds and then hang up. I'm like, oh, okay. Should we like schedule that FaceTime? Oh, you're literally just calling to say hi and then you're hanging up. That's great. So just a different way of engaging when it comes to technology. So we've talked about 5 different, very different generations. And they've all, as you've seen, been influenced by different things. And that impacts what they bring to the workforce. That influences what they value. It influences what they expect out of work, what they demand out of their bosses. So, what are some ways that we can, as a group, be building bridges within the multi-generational workforce? One of the biggest things that we can do is talk about something that I will take credit. I have coined this term. It's called the respect gap. So we've talked about the generation gap, that what happens between each subsequent generation, so many differences in their attitudes, in their behavior, in their preferences, in their traits. We have a massive respect gap happening right now in the workplace. And what that means is there are fundamental differences in how every generation both defines respect and how they experience respect. And one of the ways that that plays out is there are a lot of cultural shifts in what I call default respect. So let me give you an example. I grew up as a sweet child of the 80s, and I had parents who were college educated. They both done bachelor's and master's degrees. So I figured my parents were reasonably intelligent. If I didn't know something, I would ask my mom or dad, and they would generally know the answer. Now, as an adult, I'm like, I think they were making up answers a lot, but I sure believed them at the time. If they didn't know the answer, I would be sent to another room where we had a beautiful set of Encyclopedia Britannicas. And then it was time for Liz, look it up in the encyclopedia. What that taught me was, hey, older people know more than I do, and they are a source of knowledge, they're a source of wisdom. And also, I need to look way outside myself to find information, like literally sitting there with an Encyclopedia Britannica. What's happening now is we have a generation of people who are digital natives who have access to all the information in the world in their hand all the time, which means I don't need to ask my mom and dad. I can look up a WikiHow on how to do that. I can find it on YouTube. I don't want to ask my boss this question because I'm afraid of my boss. I'm just going to Google instead. I'm going to ask ChatGPT. And so realizing there's a different sense of I'm not depending on older generations to give me information I need. Part of that connects to I no longer have the same type of respect for older people that used to be deeply embedded in our culture. Another way that this has played out, when you think about probably your own childhood, I don't know about you. I had a lot of experiences where I would call on our landline, rotary phone to talk to a friend. And I'd have this really awkward, sometimes stilted conversation with my friend's mom, like, um, hi, Mrs. McQueen, is Abby there? Oh, okay. Oh, I'm good. Oh, you're going to get her. Okay. But then you had to like have this forced conversation with an adult. Kids are not having that same experience anymore because they get to directly talk to their friends. They don't have to have this, they have not had the same practice with having those types of conversations. And another big shift that's happened from when I was growing up and many of the generations before me, there was a sense of all of my friends' parents were allowed to tell me what to do. If I was misbehaving, you better believe my friend's mom would be like, Liz, knock it off. Or, a young man walks into a building and is still wearing his hat, another adult's going to say, hey, take your hat off. We're now in an era where there's a sense of you don't get to tell other people's kids what to do. And so there's younger people are now only saying, well, I only have to do what my specific parent says. That has major implications for entering the workplace when all of a sudden you have a supervisor telling you what to do, and you haven't had a lot of experience in that in your developmental years. So just something to consider. Well, how do we find out what respect looks like to different generations? As promised, I mentioned Aretha Franklin earlier in our presentation, and she has this great song. She says, RESPECT, find out what it means to me. That's an instruction right there. If you don't know how somebody else experiences respect in the workplace, it's okay to ask, to genuinely ask the question, what would respect look like to you? What kind of formality in written conversation? What kind of format would be meaningful? What kind of tone? And realizing when there is potentially a baby boomer who's grown up in an era of I wear a suit and tie to work, I address my supervisor as Mr. or Mrs. So and so, to now have younger generations who might be coming in what is to work in what is perceived as sloppy clothing and saying, starting an email to their supervisor with like, yo, you would have never done that 20 years ago, but there's just more casual interaction happening. This is where a lot of those communication breakdowns can happen. So there's a consulting firm out of Australia who does a lot of work when it comes to generations and future casting and demography. And they found the most important factor to build healthy multi-generational teams and intergenerational teams is respect. So let's take a look at what does respect look like to different generations. There's a lot of text here. I'm not going to read all of it, but you feel free to read it for yourself. When you think about baby boomers and all the context we talked about for them, respect came through all of the sweat equity that they put in. They worked hard. They did the time. They deferred to hierarchy, and they showed up in a certain way that was considered professional. In a work context, what that means is if you are a baby boomer, you expect younger generations to give you default respect because of your age and experience. And you are preferring that younger generations share the same values that you do when it comes to things like speaking well of your workplace and defending the Constitution of the United States and being very patriotic and realizing there's a lot of differences now generationally with those things, but that's an expectation. And doing something different than that can feel disrespectful. So many baby boomers, when you're in a conversation, they want eye contact, undivided attention. If you're trying to have a conversation and you're doing this, looking down at your phone and sending a text message, they will feel disrespected. And so recognizing those are things that if you don't talk about and acknowledge and have an open conversation about in the workplace, there's a lot of tension that is built in that dynamic. When we talked about Gen Xers and how they had grown up in a time of so much corporate downsizing, there's all sorts of scandals going on. As a result, they want to have their independence. They want to be allowed to do work at their own pace. They don't want to be micromanaged. They're like, leave me alone, respect my boundaries, and give me autonomy to get my job done. Very committed to things like mutual respect. If you respect me, I'll respect you. As I mentioned, not having micromanagement, time management is important. Don't show up 20 minutes late to this meeting or I'm going to feel super disrespected. And there's also a sense among a lot of Gen Xers of, I have a life outside of work. I'm shutting down. It's time for me to go and do my own thing. Then entered millennials into this already like churning morass of all sorts of generations. And think about what happened between kind of 1980 and in the year 2000. So much change, rapid rate of acceleration. They also grew up in a time of empowerment, be anything you can be. That they bring all those things into what they expect out of work. They want to be seen as I am an individual, I have a voice. I want you to see and affirm the work that I'm doing. And I expect my leaders to be better at the things that they're asking me to do. I want to look to them and see an example. There also is a huge value among millennials of I want you to listen to my perspective, even if you don't change what you do, Just listen and let me be heard. You can go do something else, but if you don't give me the chance to at least share my perspective, I feel devalued. They also want to be known for the things that they acknowledge. Clarity, direct communication are really important. And then also leaders who don't just sit on the like, well, because I said so, I'm your boss. They want to see respect earned through action and through modeling. Now we have Gen Zers entering the workforce. And let me tell you, their expectations are so different with what they want out of work and what they expect from their supervisors. They want clarity, they want inclusion, they want to have a voice at the table from the very beginning of their work time. They're not going to wait for 3 years for anybody to listen to what they have to say. They want to have a voice right away. They have a really high value on ethical leadership. They're not going to stay at organizations where there is a major disconnect between their personal values and the values of the organization. Or if they see things like toxic leadership, unethical leadership, they are out. They will go find another job. It also means, in their context, respect means being seen for who they are, that their identity and the many facets of their identity are seen, valued, and appreciated. If you have had a conversation with a Gen Zer, or maybe you are a Gen Zer on this call, there's a high priority on, I want to know what my job actually is. What is the job description? Be really clear about what you expect from my work. Don't give me some fuzzy, oh, we'll just figure it out. I want to know. And also, I want you to respect that when it's the end of the day and I'm going home, I'm not checking Slack after work. Like, I'm not getting paid to volunteer at my job. I'm clocking in, I'm clocking out. That is a major shift. There's also a really strong desire among Gen Zers for a more like democracy, more flattened organizations, which is challenging because by nature, organizations are hierarchical. Higher education, super hierarchical. And so what does it mean to talk about some of the realities of hierarchy while still giving space and freedom to be more on the same level, or there's more approachability? They also want to know that their ideas matter, that people listen and care about the things they have to say. So that's a little bit about the respect gap. Let's talk, what are some of the strengths of teams that are doing a great job with intergenerational communication and relationships? Well, they're way better at working together because they're aware, they have a lens to understand the other people they're working with. And instead of just getting annoyed or being judgmental, they can be curious and say, I've noticed that this other person on my team who's 20 years older than I am really prefers to communicate like this. I can be aware of that. They're more aware of some of the digital divide between older and younger generations and can navigate that better. They are also really welcoming of having more perspectives. So instead of we're all thinking the same way, we're all wanting to do the same thing, let's bring a bunch of ideas to the table and then think about what makes sense. Also, diverse teams are more productive than teams that are not diverse. So let's talk about a couple of tips if you are leading or you are part of a multi-generational team. Number one thing, be authentic. Younger generations can sniff out that inauthenticity in like 2 seconds. So doing the performative, like, oh, how was your weekend? If you don't actually care to hear their answer and you don't genuinely want to know them, it's not going to come off well. So be genuine, be caring in the interactions, making sure that your words align with your actions. If your company has, here are our core values, make sure that those are actually lived out and not just something that are on a poster on a wall. It shapes and influences the way that people work together. Being humble and being approachable. It might shock you to learn how much anxiety Gen Zers have when it comes to approaching a supervisor in the workplace. Many of them are terrified. And you're probably thinking, but I'm so warm and approachable. And you are. And yet there's a breakdown there. And so, what are ways that you can be really open and invite in that perspective? Also, as you're leading multi-generational teams, there's a need to recognize there are things that bring us all together, right? We all want purpose, we want connection, we want meaning, we want to have a shared vision. But also, people are individuals. They're motivated differently. Individual stories matter. So knowing how individual people are motivated is really important, and being able to hold that intention with. And we still have this common vision and goal that we're working towards. And then leading your teams with empathy, getting different perspectives, and curiosity. I would love to hear from you if you're willing to share in the chat. What's one thing you would love to take away, or something that stuck with you in this training that you want to apply to your role something you're thinking about, maybe even in context of your family. Um, what do you want to think about with multi-generational workforce? Where do you go from here? I'd love to hear some thoughts. And then I'll flip over here to if there are questions or observations that you would like to make. Let's open it up. Any thoughts? Oh, I like that. Yeah, rethinking respect and what it means. So, so important. I'm always learning more. Yes, there isn't one right way. That is such a huge thing, and that causes a lot of generational tension of, but this is the way we've always done it. Just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean it's the only way to do something. Mm. Yes, remote teams where you don't get the same opportunity to be having face-to-face conversation. Yes, Maggie, asking your teenage daughters, been a huge takeaway in a lot of trainings. People saying, I'm actually going to ask my kids, how do they experience respect from me? So great, so helpful. Are there questions that you have? You're welcome to type them in the chat, or Nicole, it's up to you. If you want to unmute and ask a question, that is okay too. I love a little Q&A time. And I'll switch over here just so I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn and have some further conversation. So I'll leave that up if there are questions. Would love to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Liz. I do have a few questions. First is, as you studied Gen Z, I'm curious, what surprised you the most? And yeah, do you want to start there as you
Yeah.
dove in?
So when after taking a real deep dive on Gen Z, one of the things that really stuck out to me is purpose and knowing why is a really, really big thing for them. So coming
Mhm.
from, I think, an upbringing where parents saying, because I said so, was a perfectly adequate answer, that just doesn't fly as much anymore. And realizing to truly engage and motivate Gen Z, just giving them a little explanation of like, this is why we're doing this. This is why I'm asking you to do that is just taps into their potential. They're really driven by purpose. And so when they are given some explanation, or this is why the work that you're doing is helping us reach this goal, it's helping us get where we want to go, being explicit, you might think, well, we all know this is why we're doing it. And you may be surprised to find out, oh, actually, we aren't all on the same page about why we're doing that. So being really clear, that's something that surprised me is how important the why was. That was me working with college students
Yeah.
all the time. Let me give you the why we're doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that highlights how we can just enter into any conversation or situation with assumptions. So that
Yeah.
clarity, that makes sense. I see Rob has his hand raised.
Yeah, Nicole, I'm gonna go. Liz, first
Yeah.
off, fascinating conversation, fascinating presentation. Really enjoy the multi-generational approach into work, into leadership. So, some of my questions are going to be around the respect gap.
Yeah.
And so, respect in the experiences, the communication style, helpful how you broke that down. Yeah, I'm Gen X, so I'll get that out of the way. My focus is going to be around millennials and how you lead somebody who wants to be individualized or seen as an individual, but they're part of a team.
Yeah.
And then, secondly, is Gen Z and the expectations that they have a voice at the table immediately. Um, how do you honor that with again a Gen X perspective of reality? And you haven't earned that yet.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with the Gen X one. And I sorry, Gen X, the Gen Z question you asked. And then remind me if I don't remember to answer the
Yep.
millennial. So when I think about the context of Gen Z, let's be honest, everyone has a ton of work responsibilities. And you can't spend your entire workday directly managing and answering every single question. However, Gen Zers tend to do well with shorter and more frequent check-ins. So if you grow up in a model of, I'm going to have a 1 hour one-on-one with my boss once a month, that is not enough because they will sit in some of that like anxiety or the loop of, I don't know what to do. If there's a built-in structure and it does not need to be long, a 5 to 10 minute check-in can really help. Um, it can accomplish multiple things. One of them is that gives them a chance with you to share their perspective that maybe isn't appropriate to share in a large, board meeting, but they can share those ideas with you and you can then coach them individually in that way. So it gives them a voice with you as their supervisor. It also provides a space to kind of flatten some of that hierarchy of seeing my supervisor is someone I actually can go to. And I do see the comment, Abby, you just made. It feels micromanagey because I would feel micromanaged as a millennial if my boss was like, let's check in every day for 5 minutes. I'd be like, why are you stalking me? Like, leave me alone. But I think actually having an open conversation to say, hey, I'm thinking about, and maybe it's not every day, what if every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we connect for 10 minutes? That I think just because their whole world happens so quickly. Um, Also, Rob, I was just reading an article about how different generations view the timeline of projects that they're working on. And baby boomers tend to think in terms of like years and decades. And then we go to like Gen X and they're thinking more in terms of like months and years. And then millennials thinking about projects in terms of like weeks and months. And Gen Z is thinking, what's happening in this project in the term of days and weeks? The sense of time and how long time things should take is really, really different. So having a conversation about what's the applicability to what you're doing in the short term can be really helpful. Even if you're working on like a multi-year project, how do you break that up so that for somebody who's used to things changing really quickly, you keep that engagement? There's also a reframe thinking about how you view timing for projects and what's a reasonable length of time. And then, Rob, at the beginning, you were saying you asked a
The
question.
millennials,
Millennial.
so millennials who like individuality, but you're part of a team.
Yeah. I do think with millennials, and again, this is where everybody's a little bit different. The reality of figuring out how can you as a supervisor invest in a level of individual connection with them so they feel known and seen. And then also talking about having an open conversation about what does it mean to work as a team when you're all bringing your individual things together and your individual perspectives and your individual abilities, because I do think there is an overall sense of, well, we'll just pull together these 10 great people and we'll throw them in a room and put them on a team and they're just naturally going to work together, and realizing it's going to take more specific direction of guiding them, of taking the time as a supervisor to figure out who is actually on this team, what are the strengths that I see, and then how can I help use those things to set them up for success. I know in my own life when I've had supervisors who are aware of, okay, this is Liz's skill set, so I'm going to ask her to play this kind of role on a team. That affirms for me both the I get to work with colleagues, but my boss sees me and knows me for me, and that's a really high value. But again, it takes time and investment from a supervisor to have those individual conversations, to ask good coaching questions, and to get at really getting to know your people so you can motivate them well. Great questions, Rob. Are there other?
Yeah, I'm just looking at our time and we have time for one more question.
I see a hand
Anybody
raised.
else? Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This has been really, really helpful. I feel like as someone who's like that Zennial generation and is very much like, I feel like I'm just absolutely stuck in middle management, that I'm sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like, I can't control the communication styles and preferences of my leadership, but they are, can be very highly dissatisfying to the younger individuals that I work with. And I'm like, I feel like I'm constantly stuck translating, and it's like they're so far apart, they're not talking to each other. So like I am stuck being in that translation. Do you have any guidance, suggestions? Will it ever get better?
That is such a great, that's such a great question. Would you be willing to connect with me individually after this? And I would love to have a conversation with you. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. Let's have a phone call because I would love to talk to you more about some ways to mediate that because you're in a really unique spot. And I think many millennials are. So I would love to connect longer offline with you.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Well, Liz, thank you so much for this valuable information. We appreciate it. And it's what a gift to talk with somebody who's done a deep dive on millennial differences. And one of the things I'm taking with me today is just how important it is to be intentional. And as we think about being career leaders and taking ownership over our own professional development, knowing who's in the room and how to communicate effectively and to kind of think thoughtfully about respect and what that looks like. So I know Liz is very open to connecting. She works with organizations on how to work within teams. And so if you have any interest in connecting with her further about the work that she does, I know that she has a lot of value add as we've experienced today. And then as we wrap up for today, I just wanted to remind those of you on the call your lifetime career support and the access that you have to individual career coaching, our online resources, discounted executive education courses, our job search groups, and then we will continue to have professional development opportunities. And so on my next slide, I just want to highlight a couple other upcoming events. So next Wednesday, we're doing a Build Your Value Proposition. This is an interactive session, and I'd love to see you at that. And then in December, on December 5th, if you want to head to the next slide for me, Liz, thank you. On December 5th, we have 5 steps to launching your job search, and would love to see you at that too. And then in 2026, we'll bring back our job search groups. I also just want to acknowledge that our community has faced layoffs in the last few weeks, and Carlson just wants to be really attentive to you in that. And so we have a Navigating a Layoff series coming your way too, and you can see the link in the chat. So if you've been impacted by a layoff recently, we would love to have you at these groups starting on the 14th of November. And then the second one is on the 21st. The registration link is in the chat for you with that. But we're here to support you as you continue your career management. And thank you again today, Liz, for your time.
You're so welcome. And feel free to connect. I would love to connect individually with any of you and talk about how I can support you and your teams.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Take care, everybody.